Welcome everyone. We're starting the panel on feminist struggles on the patent system. We are the Humanitarian Congress, and it's one of the few spaces that has opened up recently to discussing the feminist perspective in the humanitarian space, something that I could not have imagined 10 years ago. So this is a very welcome break from our normal webinars, I have to say. I'd like to welcome everybody who's joining the panel. And highlight really very clearly that we have some translation. Please do go to the interpretation button and see the options for translation. And I just also wanted to sort of highlight that this panel was put together quite quickly, and I'm going to give you a brief background on what it is all about. So one of the issues that sort of has affected us in access to medicines and the high pricing and availability of drugs and testing has been the area of breast cancer. And I don't know how many of you follow cancers that have been proved deadly to women, breast cancer and of course cervical cancer, the two big deadly cancers for women. So do go out there and check yourself for them for sure. And number two, I wanted to sort of highlight is this, that in our struggles for increasing access to one of the key breast cancer drugs, trastuzumab, I refuse to take the name of the brand that Roche has. And trastuzumab proved to be one of the first effective drugs that offered an option beyond cut, slash, and burn in cancer that we are so used to. So I think trastuzumab in itself has sort of speared access to medicine battles, which have had the very rich participation of the women's movement and the feminist movement, and has been perhaps, and at least in India, I would say, an area that I would say really led to an increased access to the drug. So for all of you who've been watching the drug trastuzumab, it doesn't work for all forms of breast cancer. It does work for HER2 positive women. And it costs, in India, it costs 2 million rupees for a course of treatment. In South Africa, it costs $38,000 and above. And it has been in that kind of pricing sphere across the world. And Roche, the pharmaceutical corporation based in Switzerland, has very effectively played that monopoly against access. So that's the backdrop of the drug that we are talking about. And we're also going to talk about what were the key moments in the struggle for access to trastuzumab, how they were influenced by the access to movement, access to treatment movement, but also very clearly by the rights movement and the women's movement. And I would like to welcome all of you and your comments and of course your opinion on this issue. We are here for an hour, so I'm going to go straight to the introductions. So the first panelist that I would like to introduce is Bhavani Twala. She's from an organization that is very dear to me and all of us in the Access Movement, which is Section 27, a public interest law center. It was set up actually to protect constitutional right to health and education. And she herself is a very experienced legal researcher who is concentrating her efforts now in access to medicines, HIV and the law, and right to food in Section 27. But what is interesting about Bhavani's profile is that she's actually interested in changing systems and looking at systems and how law and policies can improve them. He has extensive experience in the Supreme Court in Kenya and in the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and of course with other organizations. So welcome, Bhavani, to the panel. Hi. Yeah. The second speaker I would like to introduce is Kalyani Menon Sen. Kalyani Menon Sen is a feminist researcher with 3 decades of experience, and very interestingly, she focuses on economic policy decisions that impact the lives of women on the ground. And I think the patent system is particularly a similar economic policy decision that many governments unfortunately have made against us. She has worked with Mahila Samakhya. For those who are familiar with the women's movement, Mahila Samakhya has been a stellar organization that has worked in India on women's rights. She herself, Kalyani, as a feminist and a women's rights person, has, worked on, landless women farmers who looked at sustainable ways of farming, and of course, has joined struggles against violence, particularly that have been triggered by the state itself. And in 2012, she walked into my office along and asked, about this drug that I had no idea about, and forced us, some of us who worked on access to medicines, to think about what we could do for breast cancer. And so, welcome, Kanyali, and I'm very happy to have you here.
Good to be here.
Yes. So Preeti Radhakrishnan, I would say, is a very dear friend, and the first thing that I would like to introduce about her, that she strongly believes in justice. She's one of the lawyers who actually laid the groundwork for the patent challenges that public interest groups have been doing in India. And at that time, I was completely skeptical. How are we going to manage this organic chemistry? How are we going to do it all? And Preeti was one of the firm believers that, as public interest and legal aid lawyers, we had to challenge patents in India. And she spawned that work in India and has left a very rich legacy for all of us to fight for. She's also, of course, now based in the United States, is the founder of IMAC, a nonprofit, that MSF itself has, sought advice from several times. But more recently, they are concentrating on the Biden-Harris administration and a 10-point agenda to bring equity into the patent system. And, the influence of IMAC's work is reflected in the New York Times editorial boards of endorsement or bringing more equity into the patent system, something that we all need to speak more about. So Preeti, welcome to the panel as well. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to get right into the discussion because we just have an hour. And, let me start with you, Kalyani. What triggered you to start the struggle for the breast cancer drug, trastuzumab, in 2012 in India?
Thanks, Lena. That really brings memories back of walking into your office, as you said, one day in 2012. That's 10 years ago. And the reason why I was there was because a young colleague of mine, a very young colleague of mine, had been diagnosed with breast cancer. And she had been told that it's HER2 plus cancer. And her treating doctor told her, we'll go for conventional chemo. There is another drug, but that's too expensive for you, so let's not even go there. I mean, she was a worker in an NGO with, NGO salaries in India are not great. A single woman struggling to survive in Delhi alone. So she told me about this when she came back from the consultation, and I can't even begin to describe how horrified I was by that sort of so-called choice that the doctor gave her of treatment. In any case, patients don't have much choice. You do what the doctor tells you, you go into the treatment that the doctor suggests for you. But the very idea that there is a drug which is very effective for this particular kind of cancer, that doctors know about that drug, but choose or not choose to tell their patients about it based on their judgment of what a person can afford or not, it just seemed to me to typify the way in which the medical establishment just takes over women's lives and women's agency and makes choices for them like it's nothing. So basically, that's what got me started on this thing. I just felt I have to help and support this young woman to deal with the disease. So I went with her to the doctor and I said, the expense is not your business. You please start her on Herceptin. And he asked me 1,000 times, he kept saying, it's very expensive. This is what the whole course costs. It's very expensive. But I said, we'll raise the money. You just go ahead. And along with that, after talking to Lena and realizing that, it is really Roche, which is sitting like a big fat, poison toad on top of the patent, I was very clear that this can't be a single person trying to raise money for another woman's treatment. It has to be taken up as an issue by the women's movement. So that really was the beginning of a 2 or 3 year long campaign to challenge that patent, to pressurize the government to try every possible way of getting the patent thrown out and access opened for a larger segment of women.
And it was a very successful campaign, I have to say. And just, stemming from that question, Preeti, you talked about justice in the patent system. Coming straight to you, people talk about, high pricing is a problem, monopolies is a problem. But do you see this as an issue of equity and discrimination that has, sort of affected people in the global south and across the world?
Yes, absolutely. Most recently, the Commission to End Racial Discrimination said in the context of COVID that the inequity that we saw in the last 3 years and how medical products were reaching people all over the world, the way it was concentrated primarily in wealthy countries in terms of who got access and then how many countries were left behind. The Commission basically stated that it's reproducing colonial hierarchies and that this is the overall economic and trade systems, but the intellectual property system in particular is fueling inequality and is a clear case of structural discrimination. And that was reinforced by the UN Special Rapporteur on Health. And so I think that, what so many of us have been saying for so long, have been advocating for, litigating for, is now being set down in the generational record through the United Nations, through country governments even. I never thought I'd see the day when the United States took a position on intellectual property actually needing to be waived or exceptions being made to how the monopoly-based model works. But we're seeing that happen now too. So it's a moment, I think, where this work is being actually increasingly seen as an issue of equity and justice.
And I couldn't sort of reinforce that, even though in MSF we rarely use that language, but I have to say that it is heartening to see the kind of work that organizations have done around COVID to bring the issue of injustice to all of our, sort of tables. I just wanted to go down to, Bhavne and ask you, you heard what, Kalyani said. Does it resonate in South Africa? Have you all had the same struggle to access the drug trastuzumab, and what's happened with that struggle to access breast cancer treatment? Bhavne, yeah.
Paulina, so this struggle has been ongoing for, I'd say, at least 10 years now, and how the movement has grown. So how the availability of trastuzumab works here is that initially it was, when it did become available, it became available in the public sector, but not in the private sector. So many women who had been, paying their medical aid fees would get diagnosed with HER2+, and then they would find that their medical scheme refused to cover it. And so you had these individual women taking on medical aid schemes, trying to get them to pay for the treatment, and some would pay and they would be successful, and some would pay and some would not. And you also found that it was more expensive in the private sector, almost double the cost than in the private sector. And so eventually these women grew in the movement, and it became, Cancer Alliance joined that fight together with Fix the Patent laws. and they really advocated for the reduction of that cost and the availability of the drug in the private sector. And what we've seen, or the culmination of that movement, is now that the Competition Commission instituted an investigation into the pricing of trastuzumab, and it found that it was a violation of human rights, and that the pricing of the drug prevented almost 10,000 women from accessing medicine. Could have saved the lives of 10,000 women between 2017 and 2019. And that's really huge. And it's been referred to the Competition Tribunal for prosecution. And that is currently ongoing. And I think that is fundamental in terms of validating and confirming, like Priti had said, things that women had been fighting for and saying for such a long time. Another thing is that now that Roche is facing this issue and their patent is about to run out, initially they'd said you need 18 sessions. And so now they're saying, oh, the research has revealed that you only need 8 to 9. And so even in the number of sessions that were required in the treatment has decreased. And so Roche has really benefited off of undermining and undervaluing women's rights and their right to access medicine and women's lives, really. And I think it's really a pivotal moment that they're now being held accountable for this.
Yeah, absolutely. And out of the 10,000 women, it was Tobeka who fought for access to the drug and brought this whole issue to the forefront in South Africa, along with all the organizations in South Africa. And see, one of the things that I wanted to come back to you, Kalyani, and you started that conversation about double standards. And, do you think I shouldn't say use the word think, but I would just say simply, do you see that double standard for women, rich and poor, between what rich women are being offered and what poor women are being offered across the world? And of course, that's influenced by many things. But if you could, sort of respond to that.
Absolutely. And particularly being in India, where we have, just like we have a twin track education system, we have a twin track health system. So if you can afford it, you go to the private sector. And if you can't afford it, you go to a government hospital where you take what you get. So as far as trastuzumab is concerned, I quickly discovered that Chaitali's story is not unique. I met lots and lots of women, lots and lots of families with HER2 plus breast cancer who knew about the drug, but who didn't get it, who chose not to get it. So what kind of a choice? I mean, it's ridiculous. I remember this woman who told me, it's like, we have a saying in Hindi, jale mein namak chhadakna. So it's like sprinkling salt on the wound to tell me that there is a cure, and then to tell me, unfortunately, this is what it costs, so you can't get it. And she said, please don't mention this medicine at all to my husband or family, because I know if they hear about it, they will bankrupt themselves. They'll destroy the family's future just to save me, and I don't want that. So there are thousands of women in that situation. And there's another layer also. This drug, I mean, at that time, that in 2012, all government employees, all railway employees were covered by government insurance, which completely paid for the cost of trastuzumab treatment. So if you were fortunate enough to be a central government employee, or to be married to a central government employee, you were okay. Or if you were fortunate enough to be a railway employee, your treatment would be covered. Even then, there is a gray market in the pharma sector, and prices would vary. But it's such an unjust form of separation. Just because you don't have a government job, you will have to either forego the treatment, or you will have to, sell your every asset, sell an arm and a leg in order to get the drug. And there were all kinds of unethical private practitioners who would say, okay, you don't have money for the full course, raise the money and we'll do half the course. Sometimes even half the course is effective. So, all of that was happening. And it was not just making inequalities visible, it was actually generating inequalities. So I don't know if Lena remembers this. There was this woman who was a survivor whose family had paid for the entire course and who was in remission, cancer-free at the time she spoke to me. And she was so upset. She said, families like mine, people like me, we've suffered so much, we've sold everything to get cured. And now we see, people are just going to get it like that. Of course, it never ended up with people getting it. But the sense of being badly done by, the sense of being victimized by the system just became so strong and so polarized at various moments. So it really, that whole patent system, it's nothing earth-shaking to say it is a way of creating a monopoly. But what really is shocking is that it's an economy of hope, an economy of promise that drives that system. So a drug that you hope will have hugely magical effects is patented, and that market is cornered purely on the basis of the hope that so many people have that it will be the cure that they're looking for. So it's manipulation at so many levels, and it's so cold-blooded that it's a wonder how anybody can live with it.
Absolutely. And why our lawmakers and courts can't see it? And then you said, victimization by the system is bang on, I would say. And Preeti, you've been part of the AIDS struggle and, the reform movement in India and the United States. Change is taking so much time. What is it that we can do as, sort of activists and, people who work on law and rights? What can we keep doing to keep this movement alive?
Yeah, I think, the thing that we've done since the beginning with the HIV experience, the movement, worldwide, what it has done is basically demanded of patent offices and of the patent system as a whole that it be accountable to people, not just to patent holders, companies and institutions and universities, but actually to the people who are impacted by the patents. And that work has been slow and it has been a slog, and it's been, it's actually, patents are a very technical subject. So it's been a lot of self-learning for a lot of people, but I think that we're finally starting to see that work really pay off now. Like here in the US, there's a rich history of public interest patent work with groups like the Public Patent Foundation or the ACLU, when they brought for example, the Myriad Genetics case, when human gene patenting, as a practice was challenged through litigation. That case was really path-breaking because it centered women for the first time, their lived experiences, and it demanded of the courts and the patent system that they not just be responsive to the companies who were cornering markets and actually impeding research and scientific progress in the process, but also holding those tests or other, medication out of reach. And so at that time, I think it was kind of a pivot point because they started to actually use feminist approaches in the litigation. And I just dropped a beautiful article on social media by Sandra Park from the ACLU, where she really explains the history of that case and why putting women at the center of the case actually helped win the case at the Supreme Court. But now, 10 years later, 13 years later, we're actually seeing the fruits of pushing to make sure that the patent office is responsible and understands that we as the public are actually your core constituent also. And so I think that's the work that has to continue is, people who review patents, patent examiners or patent office officials have to understand how patents impact real people's lives. And I think, Lena, you say this often, the system is completely insulated from the human consequences of its actions. And that's where we have a profound, I think, role to play.
change has been glacially slow, but finally it's coming through. And for a lot of us who feel very tired, I think it's time to remember that we just need to sort of carry this work on in the organizations and the places that we work in. Bhavani, everyone's talking, today's, space is about bringing feminist perspectives and the rights perspective into humanitarian aid and humanitarian work. And, you spoke about funding to me yesterday, and, the issue of independence has always been very dear to Doctors Without Borders' heart. And how important is independence for organizations to carry on this kind of work? And, could you highlight some of that from the South African perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Lena. I think when it comes to funding and ensuring independence for organizations, particularly with the feminist perspective, I think it's so crucial that we mitigate that risk. I think it would be disingenuous to say that there is no risk whatsoever of a loss of independence or even of overreach from donors or funders. But I think particularly with a feminist perspective, we're always applying a feminist lens to the work that we do, it never becomes irrelevant. The feminist perspective is always relevant. We used to speak about how the feminist perspective needs to be a golden thread in all the work that we do. A fundamental aspect of, feminism is intersectionality. And if we look at any rights violation or rights challenge, we'll always find that women will be affected doubly and increasingly depending on what kind of level of discrimination they're likely to face. So if you're a woman, you're likely to be whatever violation or level of discrimination everyone else is facing, you're facing more because you're a woman, more because you're a Black woman or woman of color, more because you are a girl or a queer person. And so it can never be irrelevant. And a lot of the time it's something that comes after. So for example, if you look at the HIV/AIDS movement, the focus was let's get ARVs, and then after it was, mothers need medicines that can protect the baby from getting affected by HIV. Or even with COVID, it was let's get the vaccines, and then women need or are struggling to get access to those more than men, or even that men aren't even taking those vaccines, but the women who need them more are unable to. I mean, even with access to ARVs now, though they are available, a lot of women continue to face challenges with access due to gender-based violence or economic issues in terms of being unable to afford transport money to be able to go and fetch their medication, or lacking childcare and so on. And so I really just want to emphasize the never-ending relevance of a feminist perspective in whatever humanitarian aid or human rights work that we do. And I think it's so important that, number one, funders always remain cognizant of that. And then I think in fighting for the feminist aspect of access to medicine issues, it's often something, like I said, that gets left to the back. And in continuing to push for that, it might be difficult to do that, against big pharma or companies, particularly, or even, this year with the pandemic, we saw governments protecting companies and putting, profits before people. And so it can be difficult in that kind of climate to continue to push against where the money comes from. And so I think it's important to mitigate the risk of the loss of independence by, there are a lot of things that organizations can do, but I think it's also important because the work is not done unless women are also covered in whatever we're seeking to do. And so I think that as much as there's a risk, it also provides so much opportunity for collaboration and partnership in mitigating that risk. It's often a challenge that smaller, more independent organizations might face because they might be hard pressed to take funding from particular donors or to have to kind of shift their work, and so they can find refuge and they can be strengthened by partnering with more credible and more established organizations who, as well as diversifying funding and diversifying work. And that means that, you're not held to necessarily do the will or the bidding of a funder or a donor. But I also think that in that way, the movement grows through collaboration and partnership. And so I think that independence is important to ensure that women don't get left behind in the work on these issues. And that it also provides a really great opportunity for collaboration and for growing the movement and ensuring that these kind of conversations are not just the conversations, but that this kind of work continues on a much broader scale.
And thank you, Bhavne, for saying that, because I think, I'm sorry to, sort of raise this, but, one of the few units in MSF that has collaborated with the women's movement and worked in partnership with marginalized communities and actually helped fund this work and, resource this work has been the Access Campaign of Médecins Sans Frontières. And I think the culture of working with movements should spread across MSF so that, we can work with an organization that does not take pharma money and reduces any funding from governments who undermine our rights, So I think the messaging on independence and, of course, the struggles on funding are so grave that, of course, we need to preserve the few funders or, people who work in partnership with us. And I think in that sense, MSF, when it restructures its access work, needs to think that that shouldn't be throwing its baby out with the bath water. That it's the Access Campaign has been at the heart of working with movements like yours. So I'm going to sort of bring that back to Kalyani. You sort of inadvertently triggered a massive response from women and the movements across the world. The story of how we were fighting for trastuzumab suddenly resonated across the world, and suddenly people started to contact us about, what are you doing? Can you tell us more about it? Did you expect such a response? And I just sort of wanted to, ask you, how did it change you?
Yeah, I want to thank Preeti and Bhavne for what you said about your work and, tracking the trajectory of your work. I'm looking back, our position was a little different. I think my focus really was on carrying the patent conversation into women's movements and feminist spaces. And that was not really inadvertently. Now, that was a very conscious strategy to bring women's movements and feminist activists on board. And I think at least in the first wave, it was definitely a response from women who realized how much their vulnerability to breast cancer had increased, who were able to look at the statistics and see that the age band of affected women was moving to the younger and younger cohorts, and who realized the seriousness of the problem. And as you know, in India, we have a growing proportion of cases which are HER2+. But looking back, I want to ask your permission to really share my honest reflection about our campaign as a feminist.
Yes.
I asked myself, looking back, what exactly did we achieve? So as a feminist, I think of working with patents as carrying a kind of feminist transformative power. And I feel a sense of sadness and frustration, really, when I ask, what did we transform with the campaign? I don't want to sound cynical, but ultimately, I think I can say my own understanding of patents and my own perspective on patents as a feminist issue definitely expanded and transformed. And I've continued to try and do that, looking at patents through an intersectional feminist lens, which has brought me to a point where I now argue that the economic argument, the argument around women's health rights alone, doesn't take the patent movement to a transformative space. So, for instance, our campaign focused on showing up patents as mechanisms for advancing the neoliberal agenda in the health sector, on disguising that agenda with a fraud kind of a disguise of concern, but basically advancing the market and the privatization agenda. But we didn't really take on the deeper discourse behind this. We didn't really mention or show up, and maybe I didn't even understand it that way at that point, that by treating living bodies as monetizable commodities, extractable commodities, this, what is rightly called biocapitalism, it actually creates new hierarchies of power and domination. It reshapes our subjectivities, it restructures the relationship between human beings and nature. It has changed the whole domain of body politics, and it creates, of course, new ways of extracting and extractivism. So understanding this and also realizing that even though the term biocapitalism might be new, what it describes is not new. I mean, we all know in India and maybe in many other countries, we know of the stories, poverty-driven blood markets, organ markets in all our countries. But what is new now is the way that this process has really gone down to the molecular level. So separating the product at issue further and further from the human body makes it much easier to obfuscate the human face of that issue. Like Lena was saying, like Preeti was saying, hide the human consequences of what this regime is doing or what the drug industry is doing. So I'm just reminded, I was listening to Preeti talking about the gene patenting case or the breast cancer test case. I mean, I'm remembering the case of the HeLa cell line. Everybody remembers how the issue of women's agency and consent was tossed aside in that judgment, I think by a California court, that an individual woman has no right over her body parts once they are removed from the body. So the whole issue of consent, the whole issue of what a body means, of a feminist understanding of the body as my sense of myself. You can cut my hand off, but my hand is still part of my sense of myself. So this purely patriarchal logic, the connection, this is the same logic that is applied to deny women access to any rights with regard to their children. It is that same old patriarchal logic taken down to the molecular level. And I think that was a real insight that happened to me, and that I think transformed my understanding of patents. It also, there are so many cases. We have Baune, who will know much more about this than me, only from my reading, that Hoodia plant that the San women used in times of hardship and times of food insecurity to control the appetite. The way that was patented and taken away as a kind of a slimming drug. And in the process, all the other uses of the plant, the entire role and contribution of San women in managing that plant, in sustaining it, in keeping it growing, was just invisibilized. So the wiping human realities out from the picture has been perfected as an art by the entire biocapitalism discourse. And of course, the case that Preeti mentioned, the legal challenge to patenting breast cancer genes. It's an excellent example of how feminist conceptual frameworks, analytical tools, bringing women's bodies, women's labors, women's rights to the center of that courtroom case. And the central question in that case was whether genes extracted from my body can be treated as somebody else's inventions. So it's a huge advance in campaigns and a huge advance in feminist resistance to this kind of extractivism. But there's also a valid critique that, for instance, in the gene patenting case, those arguments, I'm not a lawyer and I don't perhaps have the whole picture, but Preeti is here and I'm sure she's right on top of this. There is a critique that the arguments, including in that amicus brief, they are all contained within that biopolitical discourse. So the arguments are not against patenting, but are calling for putting gene sequences out in an open public domain. So it strikes me now, as I speak, that this is yet again an intervention based on that economy of hope and faith. So you are hoping that by putting that genome out in the public domain, access will be expanded and equalized, that just putting out that knowledge in public will enable people to get access to the test, and we know exactly where the fault lies in that logic. And so I want to say that I think this is a critique that can be applied to our trastuzumab campaign also. You know, our arguments for access, we didn't challenge the larger assumptions and the premises of a drug like this. And I think Lena and I both had many uncomfortable moments because we were taking a position where we were actually singing the praises of trastuzumab while arguing for throwing out the patent, realizing full well what a thin line we were walking.
Yeah.
So it's that same old thing of how do you dismantle the house of the master with the tools of the master? It's a conundrum that has no answer. So you're constantly dancing in and out of that very patriarchal, very racist, very colonial space while trying to preserve your feminist ethics and your principles. So my point is that if our agenda is to transform the patent regime, then we as feminists, as activists against patents for women's rights, we have to realize that the struggle against patents is not a one-off fight against one company or one patent. It has to be treated as a political issue, even though saving individual lives is extraordinarily important. Our arguments against patents will have to be rooted in our history. I mean, our history of struggles for women's control over their bodies, their productive labor, their reproductive labor, their choices, their knowledge, their wisdom. It has to be grounded there. And I agree totally with what Lena said when we started this conversation. That is a larger conversation I think we have to initiate. And I think what Preeti said about the US, about a right-wing senator again opening the gene patenting debate, is a signal to me. I mean, these things are global. What happens in the US Senate has ripples all around, just as what happens in India has ripples all around. So I think we have to start that larger conversation now. We can't afford to keep fighting on individual fronts.
Yeah, and the conundrum of fighting for an individual drug while, sort of looking at the larger system and not looking to transform it is something that, yeah, all of us have felt at various points in our work. So Preeti, I'm going to just come to you, our bodies, Kalyani talked about our bodies. Our bodies are the ones that transform research. We volunteer for those clinical trials at the very early risky stages and then later on as well. Yet our contribution to research is never recognized. How do you transform a system that's so insensitive to our contributions to research? I just wanted to sort of highlight that in COVID, all of us came together, all movements came together, and we recognized that these are structural barriers. Yet, you had a few countries being able to block change. And, where in this whole process do you see us playing, taking the next steps, I would say? Is it reform in the United States? Is it, talking about, for the first time in COVID, and today in Kalyani's this thing, we have talked about colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and we never talked about the patent system in those terms. Never. In the 20 years I've worked in the access movement, people do not use those phrases. So, what do you think about this discussion, and how do we go forward from COVID and the lack of recognition to the contributions that we make to research?
Yeah, I feel like when I'm hearing what Kalyani has to say, I agree. We've been trying to find equity in a system that isn't really capable of it because it wasn't designed for us. It was designed for a specific purpose, right? To incentivize investment and to make sure money flowed in the right direction on a theory of economic growth that we don't fundamentally agree with. And so I agree that we have to start saying the things that need to be said, and maybe aligning the short-term or the medium-term campaigns with the long-term goal. I think the strength of our movement has always been that it's transnational. And we're seeing that even more now. Like, I got a text the other day that some judge was speaking at a patent law conference here in the US, and they were very upset, apparently, because these billboards have been going up that say patents kill. So they were asking me, I said, I don't know anything about this. Like, I've never heard of it. So I started to ask around, and I realized it was billboards that were going up in Europe that they were upset about. And so these things, like the COVID campaign that just happened around no patents on the vaccines and treatments, all of that, it has momentum that's being felt everywhere in some shape or form. And so I think that's important. I also think working across movements now is going to be more important than ever. I was on a panel recently here in the US about psychedelic patenting, the idea that plant life is being patented. And the US is the only country who hasn't signed on to the Nagoya Protocol, which would allow for informed consent and benefit sharing with communities. And there was an elder on the panel, and he said, you all are thinking about how do we not over patent these products, and how do we make sure competition is not blocked so that people get equitable access? Kind of like what you were saying about the breast cancer drugs, Kalyani, like just focusing on the drug and how do we get access to it. But he said, I reject your whole intellectual property system, because we live in right relationship with the land and we can't own plants. He's like, I'm listening to you guys. I can't even compute what you're talking about at a really fundamental level of the relationship between people and the planet. And you're saying, Lena, 20 years work, I've never heard somebody say that intellectual property is so sacrosanct to economies that type of conversation is not respectable in most places. But I think people are so acutely attuned to the damage that we're doing to the planet that those conversations now, there's an opening for them. Or like Kalyani was talking about the HeLa cell line, Henrietta Lax's grandchildren now, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, have sued for compensation, have demanded an apology from those who extracted those tissues for research. And so I think culture is changing. And so we as the movement would be remiss not to see this opening and not to come together and strategize about how do we go farther, how do we talk about the root causes, and how do we work intersectionally across movements too.
We are coming towards the end of a session, and I'm going to take a look at the questions, but I just sort of wanted to go back to you, Preeti, with one last question about the humanitarian aid space. There are not too many organizations within the humanitarian aid space. I think except for, Doctors Without Borders, who does active work on challenging intellectual property barriers and trying to change the R&D system towards people in the global South. The access movement has been great allies with Médecins Sans Frontières, has worked shoulder to shoulder. We've gone to jail, we've protested, we've written petitions. What do you think MSF can do towards, the access movement and keeping it alive because it has delivered millions of treatments for patients in the developing world, including MSF's own projects. So, what do you think MSF's 2.0 should be on access to medicines? Yeah.
I think that I don't know if MSF is fully aware of the impact that it has had and the role it has played in actually democracy itself all over the world. Protecting people's rights to health, to access medication in regions that are most affected by conflict, and or as so many countries, in the 20 years we've worked together, as so many countries have swung so hard to the right, freedom of basic things, speech, to organize, to get medication for people who need it. All of these things that felt really like basic rights 20 years ago weren't really even the things we were fighting for. That space has been obliterated in so many countries. And so, and I'm thinking, like the work we did in India and Brazil and Ukraine, now looking at even those three countries and like what's happened, Thailand. I mean, it's really incredible to think about maintaining that presence in those countries, not only as a healthcare provider or a provider of essential services to care and treatment, but also working so closely with movements to be a bolstering voice. So much of the work we did in India in the early 2000s was amplified and accelerated because there was a Nobel Peace Prize winning humanitarian organization who said this work is valid and it's rooted in basic ethics for humanity. And in doing so, it made sure that that space is not completely gone in those countries. No matter how far governments have gone in trying to silence the voice of journalists and activists and healthcare providers, MSF's presence has made sure that hasn't happened. And so I would just urge the institution to think about that role in maintaining democratic space and understanding more deeply, even from the people who it has served and who it has worked alongside, the role it can continue to play in that regard. Because if MSF wasn't there in the last 20 years, I shudder to think what the lives of so many people would look like, and especially for marginalized communities, what the outcomes would have been. So yeah, that was what I would think.
Thank you. I think we need to start having this dialogue more openly about MSF restructuring its access work, not just in a routine manner, but actually in a political manner. So I just sort of wanted to highlight that. There's a question about who someone responded to Kalyani about the colonial dynamics, and it's sort of highlighted from Brazil a few drugs that would be required for palliative care. About joining the movement on access to medicines, and absolutely, using the arguments that Kalyani and Preeti and Bhavna have highlighted, and of course we are open to having a discussion on these drugs after the meeting. So I'm just going to come back and sort of wind up, but before that I wanted to come to you, Bhavna. Your matters before the Competition Commission, where there's a recognition that 10,000 women lost their lives. What do you think will happen next in the battle, of holding Roche accountable for profiteering for billions of dollars at the cost of women's lives? Yeah.
Well, the answer to that is quite brief. It's currently at the Competition Tribunal. So it's currently being prosecuted, but we don't really know much about what the progress is on that. And it's likely to take up to a year. So we will hear something at the beginning of next year, hopefully, about how things are developing in that way. And then before that, we're hoping to see if we can intervene as a friend of the court, and what arguments we can make to assist the Competition Tribunal in making its decision.
So before I end the session, I just wanted to sort of say that, after a long debate, MSF has entered into the space of cancer and has started to treat cancers. And that's a welcome sort of step that we've taken. We're also looking at insulin as an area of deep entrenched inequalities. And for all those who are very interested in these discussions, feel free to reach out to any of the panelists. And, of course, all the information on the US reform, on South Africa's Fix the Patent law, all of this information is out there in the public domain. I just wanted to thank a person who took the work forward, KM Gopakumar from Third World Network, who in a way didn't just look at the individual drug and started to transform the way we talked about registering medicines and biosimilars and took it to the international global level. And Third World Network has been championing that work on regulatory reform to have more affordable biosimilars. And I think it's going to have a huge impact on our access to medicines. And I would just encourage people to look at these organizations and join the access to treatment movement globally. Thank you, Kalyani. I can't tell you how, how empowering it is to hear these arguments when, you stand in a room full of people for 20 years and no one even utters the word of of deep structural inequality and doesn't even recognize what it is doing to us. And so thank you for bringing that on. And Bhavani, I just wanted to say that all of us would support the Competition Commission case in any way we could possibly do. And Priti, I just wanted to say that, if the US does something about inequity in the patent system, it will obviously have, huge impact across the world. So good luck with that work. And please follow MSF's work on access, particularly its decision to restructure access work. And I'm publicly speaking about it openly because I think it's a political choice that MSF has to make about how it's going to restructure its access work and whether, activists across the world will continue to be connected to MSF's work on access. So please join the next panel for whoever's our participants, and please continue. And I think we'll take the discussion offline among us. We all know each other. Thank you.